By lunchtime, the morning's coffee shop incident had exploded across social media. The video of Barrett's outburst had been shared thousands of times, with people from all walks of life expressing their outrage. The hashtag #CoffeeShopRacist was trending locally, and Barrett's law firm was getting tagged in every post. In his corner office on the 47th floor, Barrett sat at his mahogany desk, his phone buzzing nonstop. First came the text from his daughter in college. "Dad, please tell me that's not you in the video everyone's sharing." Then from his wife, "James, we need to talk." Now, his secretary had already fielded dozens of calls from reporters asking for comments. The managing partner of Morrison & Wells, Richard Chen, watched the video for the fourth time in his office, his face growing grimmer with each viewing. He'd known Barrett for 20 years, played golf with him, attended his daughter's graduation. But this wasn't something he could sweep under the rug. The firm's reputation was at stake. "Get me Barrett," Chen told his assistant, "and call an emergency partners meeting for 3 p.m. Meanwhile, at the federal courthouse, Michelle was settling into her new chambers. Her assistant brought in a stack of case files, then hesitated. "Judge Washington, have you seen what's happening on social media?" Michelle nodded quietly. She'd already received numerous messages of support from colleagues across the legal community. A fellow judge had stopped by earlier, sharing how she'd faced similar discrimination early in her career. "Let's focus on our work," Michelle said simply, turning her attention to the cases before her. Back at the coffee shop, the young barista who'd witnessed everything was being interviewed by a local news reporter. "I've never seen anything like it," she said, her hands still shaky hours later. The way he spoke to her, but she was so dignified about it. "I'll never forget that." The shop's owner had put up a new sign, "All are welcome here. Hatred is not." Customers were taking photos of it and sharing them online, praising the shop's stance against discrimination. At Morrison & Wells, the partners gathered in the main conference room. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Barrett sat at one end of the table, his usual confidence replaced by a defensive scowl. The video played on the large screen behind Chen, and several partners couldn't even look at it. "This isn't just about one bad morning, James," Chen said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Our clients are calling. The Bar Association has already contacted us. People are digging up past complaints against you." And there were complaints, buried deep in HR files. A black paralegal who'd quit 2 years ago after Barrett repeatedly passed her over for promotion. A Hispanic janitor who'd filed a complaint about Barrett's inappropriate comments. A young Asian associate who'd transferred to another department after working with Barrett for just 3 months. It was just a moment of frustration, Barrett argued, his voice rising. "Everyone's so sensitive these days. That woman was holding up the line, and I had an important meeting to get to." The other partners exchanged glances. This was the Barrett they knew, never wrong, always justified, completely blind to his own behavior. "We're placing you on immediate administrative leave," Chen announced. "Pending a full investigation, please clear out your office by the end of the day." Barrett stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. As he packed up his office, he could see people watching him, whispering. The same people who used to laugh at his jokes, who used to fight to work on his cases. His phone buzzed again, this time with a notification that his country club membership had been suspended indefinitely. Another buzz, the charity board he sat on was reviewing his position. His carefully built world was crumbling around him, all because of one morning at a coffee shop. As he carried his box of belongings to his car, a young law student recognized him from the video. She quickly pulled out her phone, and Barrett hurried past, his face burning with shame. For the first time in his career, he wasn't walking tall through the lobby of his building, he was practically running. That evening, as Barrett sat alone in his home office, ignoring calls from friends and colleagues, he had no idea that his worst moment was yet to come. In 2 weeks, he would walk into a courtroom expecting business as usual. Instead, he would come face to face with Judge Michelle Washington, the very woman he had insulted that morning. The wheels of justice were already turning, and karma was about to serve a lesson Barrett would never forget. By lunchtime, the morning's coffee shop incident had exploded across social media. The video of Barrett's outburst had been shared thousands of times, with people from all walks of life expressing their outrage. The hashtag coffee shop persist was trending locally, and Barrett's law firm was getting tagged in every post. In his corner office on the 47th floor, Barrett sat at his mahogany desk, his phone buzzing nonstop. First came the text from his daughter in college. "Dad, please tell me that's not you in the video everyone's sharing." Then from his wife, "James, we need to talk." Now, his secretary had already fielded dozens of calls from reporters asking for comments. The managing partner of Morrison & Wells, Richard Chen, watched the video for the fourth time in his office, his face growing grimmer with each viewing. He'd known Barrett for 20 years, played golf with him, attended his daughter's graduation. But this wasn't something he could sweep under the rug. The firm's reputation was at stake. "Get me Barrett," Chen told his assistant, "and call an emergency partners meeting for 3 p.m. Meanwhile, at the federal courthouse, Michelle was settling into her new chambers. Her assistant brought in a stack of case files, then hesitated. "Judge Washington, have you seen what's happening on social media?" Michelle nodded quietly. She'd already received numerous messages of support from colleagues across the legal community. A fellow judge had stopped by earlier, sharing how she'd faced similar discrimination early in her career. "Let's focus on our work," Michelle said simply, turning her attention to the cases before her. Back at the coffee shop, the young barista who'd witnessed everything was being interviewed by a local news reporter. "I've never seen anything like it," she said, her hands still shaky hours later. The way he spoke to her. But she was so dignified about it. I'll never forget that. The shop's owner had put up a new sign, "Allah welcome here, hatred is not." Customers were taking photos of it and sharing them online, praising the shop's stance against discrimination. At Morrison & Wells, the partners gathered in the main conference room. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Barrett sat at one end of the table, his usual confidence replaced by a defensive scowl. The video played on the large screen behind Chen, and several partners couldn't even look at it. "This isn't just about one bad morning, James," Chen said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Our clients are calling. The Bar Association has already contacted us. People are digging up past complaints against you." And there were complaints, buried deep in HR files. A black paralegal who'd quit 2 years ago after Barrett repeatedly passed her over for promotion. A Hispanic janitor who'd filed a complaint about Barrett's inappropriate comments. A young Asian associate who'd transferred to another department after working with Barrett for just 3 months. It was just a moment of frustration, Barrett argued, his voice rising. "Everyone's so sensitive these days." "That woman was holding up the line, and I had an important meeting to get to." The other partners exchanged glances. This was the Barrett they knew, never wrong, always justified, completely blind to his own behavior. "We're placing you on immediate administrative leave," Chen announced. "Pending a full investigation, please clear out your office by the end of the day." Barrett stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. As he packed up his office, he could see people watching him, whispering. The same people who used to laugh at his jokes, who used to fight to work on his cases. His phone buzzed again, this time with a notification that his country club membership had been suspended indefinitely. Another buzz. The charity board he sat on was reviewing his position. His carefully built world was crumbling around him, all because of one morning at a coffee shop. As he carried his box of belongings to his car, a young law student recognized him from the video. She quickly pulled out her phone, and Barrett hurried past, his face burning with shame. For the first time in his career, he wasn't walking tall through the lobby of his building, he was practically running. That evening, as Barrett sat alone in his home office, ignoring calls from friends and colleagues, he had no idea that his worst moment was yet to come. In 2 weeks, he would walk into a courtroom expecting business as usual. Instead, he would come face to face with Judge Michelle Washington, the very woman he had insulted that morning. The wheels of justice were already turning, and karma was about to serve a lesson Barrett would never forget. The days following Barrett's coffee shop incident felt like a slow-motion train wreck. Each morning brought new developments, each one chipping away at the life he'd spent decades building. His firm's decision to place him on leave was just the beginning. Monday morning started with an email from his biggest client, a major real estate developer. "In light of recent events, we feel it's best to take our business elsewhere." By noon, 3 more clients had jumped ship. The clients he played golf with, whose kids had attended the same private schools as his daughter, they were all quietly distancing themselves. Barrett's phone rang. It was his old friend Tom, a partner at another law firm. "Look, James, I've got to be straight with you. We can't take you on the video, it's just too much heat right now." That was the third firm to turn him down. His reputation, once his greatest asset, had become a liability overnight. At home, things weren't any better. His wife could barely look at him. "I'd always knew you could be difficult," she said during dinner, pushing food around her plate. "But what you said to that woman, I didn't marry a man like that." Their daughter had changed her social media settings to private after getting hundreds of messages about her racist dad. The local bar association's investigation was moving forward at an unusually quick pace. Barrett sat in a sterile conference room, facing a panel of his peers. The questions were relentless. "Mr. Barrett, can you explain your history of complaints from minority staff members? Would you say this incident reflects your general attitude toward people of color? Do you believe your behavior upholds the ethical standards expected of our profession?" Barrett's answers sounded hollow even to his own ears. The excuses that had worked for years, stress, misunderstandings, high standards, fell flat in the face of that damning video. His neighbors stopped inviting him to their weekly poker games. The other parents at his son's school crossed the street when they saw him coming. Even his regular dry cleaner, who'd known him for 15 years, suddenly couldn't meet his eyes. One afternoon, Barrett found himself back at Bean and Brew, the scene of his downfall. He wasn't sure why he came, maybe to apologize, maybe to prove something to himself. The owner spotted him before he reached the door and flipped the open sign to Tilo's did. Standing on the sidewalk, Barrett watched through the window as customers enjoyed their coffee, chatting and laughing. He'd never felt so much like an outsider. A passing teenager recognized him and quickly snapped a photo. Within hours, social media was buzzing again. "Coffee shop racist tries to return to scene of crime." The final blow came when his firm called him in for another meeting. Chen looked tired, aged somehow in the past few days. "We've completed our internal investigation," he said, sliding a document across the table. "We're terminating your partnership, effective immediately." 25 years at the firm ended with a single piece of paper. Barrett's hands shook as he read the terms. They were being generous with the severance package, probably to avoid any messy legal battles. But the message was clear: he was done. Cleaning out his office felt surreal. The awards and certificates that had once made him proud now seemed meaningless. A young associate helped him carry boxes to his car, not out of kindness, but because security insisted someone accompany him. That evening, Barrett sat in his home office, surrounded by boxes of law books and framed achievements. His email inbox was full of recruiters politely rescinding their previous interest. The private social club where he'd spent countless evenings networking had refunded his annual dues. Even his golf buddies had a scheduling conflict for their regular Saturday game. He opened his laptop, thinking about writing an apology statement. The cursor blinked on the empty screen for an hour before he closed it again. What could he possibly say? How do you apologize when your true colors have been exposed to the world? Little did Barrett know, but his professional nightmare was far from over. In just a few days, he would walk into courtroom 7B at the federal courthouse, representing one of his few remaining clients in what he hoped would be a simple discrimination case. He had no idea that fate had one more twist in store, one that would force him to face not just his actions, but the person he'd become. As he sat there in his quiet house, the weight of his choices pressing down on him, Judge Michelle Washington was reviewing case files in her chambers, including one scheduled hearing that would bring their paths crossing again, this time with the power dynamics dramatically shifted. 2 weeks had passed since the coffee shop incident, and Barrett was clinging to his last remaining high-profile case, a discrimination lawsuit that could help salvage what was left of his career. He spent hours preparing, knowing this might be his last chance to prove he was still a capable lawyer. That morning, Barrett stood before his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. His hand trembled slightly as he smoothed down his silver hair. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights spent worrying about the upcoming hearing. His wife watched from the doorway, her expression a mixture of concern and lingering disappointment. "Good luck today," she said quietly, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure he deserved it. The federal courthouse loomed before him, its stone facade suddenly more intimidating than ever before. Barrett had walked up these steps hundreds of times over his career, always with confidence. Today, he clutched his briefcase like a shield, avoiding eye contact with the other attorneys and clerks who whispered as he passed. In the courthouse bathroom, Barrett splashed cold water on his face. "Pull yourself together," he muttered to his reflection. "It's just another hearing." He checked the court calendar multiple times, but it had only listed "presiding judge" to be announced. A last-minute judicial assignment wasn't unusual, but it made him uneasy. The courthouse hallway buzzed with activity. A young law clerk nearly dropped her files when she recognized Barrett, quickly scurrying away. Two attorneys who used to greet him warmly suddenly became fascinated with their phones as he passed. The whispers followed him like shadows. Courtroom 7B was already filling up when Barrett entered. His client, the owner of a small tech company facing discrimination charges, sat nervously in the gallery. Barrett tried to project confidence as he sat up at the defense table, arranging his papers with shaking hands. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." The Honorable Judge Michelle Washington presiding. Barrett's heart stopped. Time seemed to freeze as Judge Washington walked in, her black robes flowing gracefully. She was the same woman he insulted at the coffee shop, but now she carried herself with even more authority, if that was possible. The blood drained from Barrett's face as he stood on wobbly legs. The other attorneys noticed his reaction, and a low murmur spread through the courtroom. His client leaned forward, whispering urgently, "What's wrong? Do you know her?" Barrett couldn't speak. His mouth had gone completely dry. The irony was almost too perfect. Here he was, defending a discrimination case before the very person he discriminated against. A few people in the gallery were already pulling out their phones, eager to witness whatever was about to unfold. "Please be seated," Judge Washington said, her voice clear and professional. Her eyes swept the courtroom, passing over Barrett as if he were any other attorney. But he could feel it, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air like a storm cloud. As the hearing began, Barrett struggled to focus. His usually sharp legal mind felt dulled by panic. He fumbled through his opening statement, dropping papers and losing his train of thought multiple times. Judge Washington remained perfectly composed, treating him with the same professional courtesy she showed everyone else. "Mr. Barrett," she said at one point, "could you please clarify your position on the alleged discriminatory practices?" Her tone was purely professional, but the question felt like a spotlight on his own recent behavior. Barrett's collar felt too tight. Sweat trickled down his back. The words that usually came so easily to him now stumbled out in awkward chunks. Other attorneys in the courtroom watched with a mixture of fascination and second-hand embarrassment as the once mighty James Barrett crumbled under the pressure of his own actions. His client grew increasingly agitated, passing him worried notes. "What's happening? You said this would be easy." But Barrett could barely read them through his swimming vision. The same righteous anger he displayed in the coffee shop was nowhere to be found, replaced by a crushing awareness of his situation. During a brief recess, Barrett rushed to the bathroom, loosening his tie and gasping for air. In the mirror, he hardly recognized himself. The confident, successful lawyer who'd looked down on others for so long was gone, replaced by a man facing the consequences of his own prejudice. Back in the courtroom, Judge Washington continued to conduct the proceedings with unwavering professionalism. She showed no sign of personal bias, no hint of revenge. And somehow, that made it worse. Her dignity and composure only highlighted how far he had fallen. As the hearing drew to a close, Barrett knew he performed terribly. His arguments had been weak, his presentations scattered. His client was already texting another lawyer. But more than the professional failure, it was the personal realization that hit him hardest. How many times had he made others feel the way he felt right now? Small, insignificant, unworthy? Judge Washington's final words echoed through the courtroom. "We'll reconvene next week for the continuation of this hearing. Court is adjourned." She stood, gathered her papers, and left the bench with the same grace she'd shown throughout the proceedings. Barrett remained at the defense table long after everyone else had filed out, staring at his scattered papers. The universe had served him the perfect lesson in humility, and for the first time in his life, he was finally ready to learn it. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with cameras and microphones, eager to capture the story of the racist lawyer facing justice. But Barrett slipped out a side door, no longer the proud attorney who commanded attention, but a man beginning to understand the true meaning of respect and dignity. The week following Barrett's disastrous first appearance in Judge Washington's courtroom felt like the longest of his life. He barely slept, spending nights reviewing case files and preparing for the continued hearing. His home office became a cave of legal documents and empty coffee cups. His client had called him 3 times, threatening to find new counsel. "You told me you were the best defense attorney in the city," the man complained. "What happened in there?" Barrett had no good answer. How could he explain that his own prejudices had come back to haunt him in the most perfect way possible? The morning of the continued hearing arrived with gray skies and drizzling rain. Barrett's wife watched him prepare for court, noticing how he'd aged years in just a few weeks. "Maybe this is a chance," she said softly, "to show you've learned something." In his car, Barrett rehearsed his arguments again and again. The facts of the case now seemed to mock him. Here he was, defending a company against discrimination charges, while his own discriminatory behavior had been broadcast across social media. The irony wasn't lost on him. The courthouse felt different this time. Barrett no longer tried to avoid the stares and whispers. He accepted them as part of his new reality. A young intern who'd once eagerly asked for his mentorship now hurried past without a glance. The security guard who used to joke with him every morning just checked his ID in silence. Courtroom 7B was packed. Word had spread about the previous week's drama, and the gallery was filled with curious onlookers, including several young law students taking notes. Barrett could hear them whispering about the coffee shop video as he sat up at the defense table. Judge Washington entered the courtroom with the same quiet dignity she'd shown before. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and professional. "We're here to continue the discrimination case of Thompson Tech Solutions. Mr. Barrett, are you ready to proceed?" Barrett stood, his legs steadier than last time, but his heart still racing. "Yes, Your Honor," he managed, his voice smaller than he'd ever heard it. As he began his presentation, he found himself hyper-aware of every word choice, every gesture. The same man who had carelessly thrown around racial slurs in a coffee shop now carefully weighed each syllable. The hearing progressed, and something unexpected happened. Rather than completely falling apart like last time, Barrett found a new approach. His usual aggressive, domineering style was gone, replaced by something more thoughtful and measured. When discussing the discrimination allegations against his client, he spoke with a newfound understanding of their seriousness. Judge Washington noticed the change. She listened attentively, asking pointed questions that forced Barrett to dig deeper into the issues of fairness and equality. Each question felt like a lesson, though her tone remained purely professional. During a brief recess, Barrett overheard 2 attorneys talking in a hallway. "It's like watching a completely different lawyer," one said. Maybe that coffee shop video was the wake-up call he needed. The afternoon session brought the questioning of witnesses. A former employee of Thompson Tech testified about experiencing discrimination. As Barrett listened to her story, he found himself really hearing it for the first time in his career. Each word resonated with his own recent actions, making him increasingly uncomfortable with his role in defending similar behavior. His cross-examination surprised everyone, including himself. Gone was his usual attacking style. Instead, he asked questions that showed genuine interest in understanding the witness's experience. His client looked confused, then angry, but Barrett continued this new approach. Judge Washington's eyes followed the proceedings carefully. If she was surprised by Barrett's changed demeanor, she didn't show it. Her questions remained focused on the facts of the case, her treatment of both parties scrupulously fair. As the day wore on, Barrett felt something shift inside him. The humiliation of facing Judge Washington was transforming into something else, a deep sense of shame about his past behavior and, surprisingly, a desire to do better. The hearing concluded late in the afternoon. "I'll review the evidence and testimony presented today," Judge Washington announced. "We'll reconvene next week for my decision." She paused, looking directly at Barrett for the first time. "I appreciate the professional manner in which these proceedings were conducted." Those simple words hit Barrett hard. Professional manner, something he'd failed to show that morning in the coffee shop. Something Judge Washington had displayed consistently, even when facing the man who had publicly insulted her. As people filed out of the courtroom, Barrett remained seated, lost in thought. His client stormed past without a word, already on the phone with another lawyer, but Barrett barely noticed. He was too busy replaying moments from his career, seeing them in a new light. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a late afternoon sun broke through the clouds. Barrett walked down the courthouse steps, no longer the arrogant lawyer who'd entered that morning. Something had changed during those hours in Judge Washington's courtroom, something that went far beyond the case at hand. His phone buzzed with messages from his wife and daughter asking how the hearing went. For the first time in weeks, he felt he had something positive to tell them. Not about winning or losing, but about finally beginning to understand the impact of his actions. A week after the final hearing, Barrett sat alone in the courthouse cafeteria, picking at a sandwich he couldn't taste. In just 1 hour, Judge Washington would announce her decision in the discrimination case. His client had already hired another lawyer, but Barrett was required to be present for the ruling. The once bustling cafeteria fell quiet as people noticed him. A group of junior attorneys grabbed their coffee and quickly moved to another table. Barrett didn't blame them. The video of his coffee shop outburst had become required viewing in several legal ethics classes, a perfect example of how not to behave. His phone buzzed. It was his daughter. "Dad, whatever happens today, just remember what we talked about." Their conversation from the night before came flooding back. She'd finally told him how his attitudes had affected her, how she'd struggled to defend him to her college friends, how she'd started questioning her own views on race and privilege. The walk to courtroom 7B felt like a march to judgment. This time, the gallery was packed. News of the case had spread through legal circles, and everyone wanted to see the conclusion of what people were calling instant karma in action. Judge Washington entered the courtroom exactly on time, her robes flowing with quiet authority. Barrett stood with the other attorneys, his legs feeling like lead. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "Before I deliver my ruling," she said, her voice clear and measured, "I want to address the elephant in the room." Barrett's heart stopped. Many people in this courtroom are aware of an incident that occurred between myself and Mr. Barrett several weeks ago. That incident has no bearing on today's decision. Justice must be blind, even when personal feelings are involved. Barrett felt tears pricking at his eyes. Her professional integrity, even after how he treated her, made his past behavior seem even more shameful. Judge Washington continued with her ruling. She found against Barrett's former client, citing clear evidence of discriminatory practices. But it was her closing remarks that changed everything. "This case," she said, looking directly at the gallery filled with young lawyers, "reminds us that discrimination isn't always obvious. Sometimes it wears a suit and tie. Sometimes it has degrees on the wall. And sometimes," she paused, her words carrying weight, "sometimes it takes seeing ourselves clearly in the mirror of justice to understand the impact of our actions." Barrett sat there long after the courtroom emptied. Court officers gave him space, understanding that something important was happening. Finally, he stood and walked to the front of the courtroom, where Judge Washington's clerk was gathering papers. "Could you?" His voice cracked. "Could you ask Judge Washington if she has a moment?" 10 minutes later, he stood in her chambers, hands clasped behind his back like a schoolboy in the principal's office. Judge Washington sat at her desk, watching him quietly. "Your Honor, I know no apology can make up for my behavior that morning," he began, his practiced speech dissolving into raw honesty. "But seeing you conduct these proceedings with such fairness and dignity, it's shown me everything I should have been as a lawyer, everything I failed to be as a human being." Judge Washington listened without interrupting. When he finished, she spoke softly but firmly. "Mr. Barrett, do you know why I became a judge?" She didn't wait for his answer. "Because I believe that justice should be truly blind, not selectively blind. Not blind to some and sharp-eyed for others based on their skin color or background." She stood up, straightening papers on her desk. "Your apology is accepted, but it's not enough. What will you do with this experience, Mr. Barrett? How will you make this mean something more than just a personal embarrassment?" Walking out of her chambers, Barrett felt something he hadn't experienced in years: clarity. He pulled out his phone and made 3 calls, one to a diversity training organization, one to the local legal aid society, and one to his daughter. That evening, he sat in his home office, staring at his law degree on the wall. His wife brought him a cup of coffee, not from an expensive shop, but made at home with care. "You look different," she said, studying his face. "I feel different," he replied, taking the coffee with a grateful smile. "Like I'm finally seeing clearly for the first time in my career." He opened his laptop and began typing, "Dear Bar Association Ethics Committee." It was time to share his story, not as a cautionary tale of public shame, but as a testament to the possibility of real change. Outside his window, the sun was setting over Chicago, casting long shadows across the city. But inside, Barrett felt like something was dawning, a new understanding, a new purpose, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to become the kind of lawyer he should have been all along. The next morning would bring new challenges. His client was suing him for malpractice. His former firm was distancing itself further. But for the first time, Barrett faced these problems not with arrogance or anger, but with a growing sense of responsibility and a genuine desire to make amends. 6 months had passed since that life-changing day in Judge Washington's courtroom. The crisp autumn air had given way to winter, then spring, and now summer warmed the Chicago streets. The same coffee shop where everything began was bustling with its usual morning crowd, but something was different today. Barrett stood outside, taking deep breaths. He'd avoided this place for months, but today he had a purpose. Inside, the young barista who'd witnessed his outburst months ago looked up as he entered. Her eyes widened with recognition, but this time there was curiosity instead of fear in her expression. "Good morning," Barrett said quietly, stepping up to the counter. "I'd like to speak with the owner, if possible." His voice, once loud and demanding, was now gentle and respectful. The barista disappeared into the back, returning with the owner who had kicked him out that fateful day. "I've come to apologize," Barrett began, his voice steady but humble. "And to make things right, if you'll let me." He explained his plan to sponsor a series of community discussions about diversity and inclusion, using the coffee shop as the venue. The owner listened carefully, studying the man before her, so different from the one she burned 6 months ago. Later that morning, Barrett stood at a podium in a community center. The room was packed with law students, young attorneys, and community members. He'd been invited to share his story as part of a legal ethics seminar. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone. "My name is James Barrett," he began, "and 6 months ago, I was the lawyer you probably saw in that viral video." A murmur went through the crowd. "Today, I'm here to talk about what I learned about justice, dignity, and the true meaning of professional ethics." He spoke about his transformation, not just the public humiliation, but the deep, personal change that followed. He described how Judge Washington's professionalism had shown him what true dignity looked like. He shared painful stories of his past behavior, acknowledging the harm he caused to so many people over the years. In the audience, his daughter sat with tears in her eyes. She'd been angry at first, embarrassed by her father's viral infamy. But watching him now, speaking with genuine remorse and determination to change, she felt something new: pride. Barrett had spent the past months doing more than just talking. He'd taken diversity and sensitivity training courses. He'd reached out to former colleagues he'd mistreated, listening to their experiences without defending himself. He'd started volunteering at a legal aid clinic, providing free services to underserved communities. His legal practice had changed too. He'd opened a small office, focusing on civil rights cases. His first major victory had been representing a group of employees in a workplace discrimination case, the kind of case he used to defend against. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. After the seminar, a young law student approached him. "Sir," she said, "I saw your video when it went viral. I almost quit law school because I thought all successful lawyers were like that. But seeing you today, it gives me hope that people can change." That afternoon, Barrett had another speaking engagement, this time at his old firm. Chen, his former managing partner, had invited him to address the staff about professional ethics and personal growth. Walking through those familiar halls felt strange, but Barrett wasn't there to reclaim his old status. He was there to help others avoid his mistakes. As he wrapped up his talk, he noticed a familiar face in the back of the room. Judge Washington had slipped in quietly to listen. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave him a small nod, not of forgiveness, necessarily, but of acknowledgement. Barrett had turned his moment of shame into a catalyst for change. Later that evening, Barrett sat in his home office looking at a photo taken earlier that day. It showed him standing with a diverse group of young lawyers he'd been mentoring. His wife came in, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're different," she said softly. "Finally becoming the man I always hoped you could be." He picked up his phone and opened social media. The video that had destroyed his old life was still there, but now it was accompanied by new videos, clips from his talks, articles about his transformation, stories of his advocacy work. His fall from grace had become a story of redemption. As night fell over Chicago, Barrett stood at his window, reflecting on his journey. The man who had walked into that coffee shop 6 months ago was gone. In his place stood someone who had learned the hardest lesson of his life in the most public way possible, and was grateful for it. Tomorrow, he would continue his work, knowing that true change isn't about grand gestures or public speeches. It's about the daily choice to be better, to do better, and to help others do the same. His story had become more than just a viral moment of karma, it had become a testament to the possibility of genuine transformation. And somewhere in her chambers, Judge Washington was reviewing cases for the next day, knowing that justice sometimes works in unexpected ways, and that true change can come from the most unlikely sources.